My name is Olivia Ruiz, and on behalf of TBI, the Transborder Institute at the University of San Diego, I want to welcome you tonight to the panel discussion, The Effects of Violence in Mexico on Migration and Immigration Policy, which is going to focus especially on questions of asylum. This panel discussion is the result of group efforts, but it's been spearheaded by Ginger Jacobs, Ms. Jacobs, and Veronica Barba of the Immigration Justice Project. It fits in very nicely with the efforts of the Transborder Institute, which since its creation in 1994 has been addressing questions of migration and immigration policy, locally, but also nationally and internationally. We are very happy to be hosting this panel discussion tonight, and I think we will have a very interesting and I hope fruitful discussion, all of us, regarding this question of asylum, which of course has gained a lot of notoriety and is now part of sort of the media discussion with anything that's related to violence in Mexico. And with that, I'd like to turn over the podium to Ms. Jacobs, who will now introduce the topic.
Thank you very much, Professor Ruiz. And what she neglected to mention is she was also instrumental in planning and putting together the panel and had a lot of amazing ideas. So thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the American Bar Association's Immigration Justice Project. Veronica Barba, who's on our panel, is our executive director, and I am the chairperson of the advisory board for the project. And the Immigration Justice Project is both a legal orientation program, which is located at the Immigration Detention Facility here in San Diego County. It's run by CCA, which is a private contractor for the Department of Homeland Security. And the IJP does virtually daily, but many times a week, they do a legal orientation presentation for any detained immigrant who is housed in the facility. And then they also have a pro bono project where we try to pair unrepresented immigrants with pro bono attorneys in the community. And so part of why we wanted to do panels like this is that we are trying to expand our connections within the community. And we've seen a lot of fruit born from that. One specific example is that the detention facility here in San Diego County houses a large unit for mentally ill detainees. And so the IJP has been working on putting together a working group with some psychologists and doctors in the community to try to figure out how to best serve the needs of mentally ill immigrant detainees. So this panel and this discussion is part of us trying to reach out to the community, to form ties and alliances, and to be working together on different projects of concern to the immigrant population. And with that, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. This promises to be a very interesting and lively discussion. Professor Olivia Ruiz is a cultural anthropologist. She has done an extensive amount of field work, both in the United States and in Mexico, and also in Central America. Of particular interest to her is sexual violence and its impact on migrants. And so I have the feeling this is going to be a continuing conversation that she's going to be having with the project, as we often see those patterns continuing sometimes once the the migrant population is within the United States, and there's a large intersection between forms of immigration relief for survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. Dr. David Shirk basically needs no introduction. You all, I'm sure, know him. He is the director of the Transborder Institute and a professor of political science here at USD. He specializes in Mexican politics, U.S.-Mexican relations, and the U.S.-Mexican border. Of note, particularly this evening, is that he's a principal investigator for the Justice in Mexico Project, which is a research initiative on public security and rule of law issues in Mexico. So he has a lot to contribute to the discussion of what's actually happening on the ground in Mexico in terms of cartel violence and how the Mexican government is dealing with that violence, and sort of a reality check for what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis in Mexico. Our next panelist is Amy Isackson. Many of you have heard her on NPR. She was with KPBS here in San Diego for about 7 years, and she covers breaking news and feature stories on the California-Mexico border issues as well as immigration. She is now freelance, and her pieces are published on NPR, among other media outlets, for both local and national interest. I'm going to be speaking as well this evening. I am a partner with the law firm of Jacobs, Schlesinger, and Shepard here in San Diego. We are an immigration and appellate law firm with 5 attorneys, and 3 of the 5 specialize in immigration law. Veronica Barba is a panelist. She's the director of the Immigration Justice Project, and as I mentioned, she is constantly in the detention center, and so really has her ear to the ground on what kinds of cases and claims people are bringing when they come from other countries to San Diego. And finally, we have Douglas Nelson on the panel. He is an alum. He's a 1994 graduate of the USD School of Law. He has clerked for the Immigration Court here in San Diego, and the stories about him and his clerkship are legendary among the immigration judges and still much discussed. After his clerkship ended with the Immigration Court, he began his own law practice and has developed an incredible reputation for ethics and professionalism within the immigration bar. He is a frequent speaker on immigration issues, and we're very lucky to have him as part of the panel this evening. So with that, Dr. Shirk is going to begin as our first presenter, but Professor Ruiz is going to be moderating the panel, so I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, we'll begin with Dr. Shirk, and I think, as Ginger said, he needs no introduction. Dr. Shirk, or David as I call him, will give you an overview of the question of violence in Mexico, especially drug-related, cartel-related violence in Mexico.
I want to thank Ginger and Olivia for their efforts to put this program together this evening. I especially want to acknowledge Olivia, who is a visiting scholar here with us at the Transborder Institute this year during her sabbatical on leave from the Colegio de la Frontera Norte. She's been a tremendous asset to us in looking at immigration issues, and we'll be very pleased to be working with her throughout this year. I also want to thank the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies, of which our institute is a part, for helping us to do the logistics of managing this event. One of the key logistics I should mention is that this event is actually being recorded for subsequent broadcast online. So please take note of that if you have questions or comments, or if you do not wish to appear in the broadcast. The cameras are pointed this way, so I don't think you'll have too much concern. That said, the last thing I want to bring your attention to very briefly is that this weekend, the Transborder Institute is hosting a data gathering session for some of our students to participate in a drug violence monitoring effort that's been ongoing here for the last several years, and which has been very instrumental to some of the research that I'm going to present here very briefly. If you are a student here at the university or in the region and you're interested in volunteering some of your time, we'll be meeting here on campus this Saturday from 9 to 3 p.m. to try to document and put a face on some of the violence that I'm going to discuss here at this time. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to come talk to me afterwards. There's also information available through our website. The topic tonight, drug violence and displacement, is a topic that has become very prominent in the media over the last year or two. Many people have been focusing on Mexico's violence for some time, but the effects of that violence and the displacement effects in particular in causing people to leave their homes either internally or actually fleeing to the United States has become something, I think, of much greater concern. So I want to talk initially about Mexico's security situation and then say a few things very briefly about displacement. I do want to point out that some of the images are rather disturbing. The topic is disturbing, and so what we're seeing here is I think, a small glimmer of the truly awful and horrendous kinds of violence that we're seeing south of the border. First of all, I want to point out as both Olivia and Ginger have mentioned, that what we've seen in the last few years has been a significant escalation in levels of what we call drug-related homicide in Mexico. This has actually caused an increase in Mexico's overall homicide rate. But we're focused here, and the data that I'm presenting are narrowly focused on those homicides that have been designated as drug-related or drug trafficking-related. The specifics of that I can go into in much more detail, but to be not too flippant, I mean, if you have a narco mensaje, narco message painted on you, if you've been shot by an AK-47, if you have been found with large quantities of drugs at the scene of your homicide, those are the kinds of variables that are used to classify some of these homicides as drug-related. They're also tracked by both the Mexican government and by the media, and by any measure that you want to use, what we've seen is a dramatic increase in escalation in this level of violence. Now, that said, I don't want to hyperbolize the violence. I want you to know that you can go to Baja California, you can go to Mexico City, you can even go, as I did last year, several times to Ciudad Juarez and not become a statistic. Mexico, and particularly in comparison to places like Colombia, which my colleague Milburn Line at the Institute for Peace and Justice looks at, is actually overall quite safe, and your odds of being killed by a drug trafficker are fairly low, unless you are a drug trafficker, in which case they go way up. That's because the violence is very concentrated in specific geographic regions, and it is specific. It is concentrated for very particular populations, people who are actively involved in the drug trade, police officers, some elected officials, and journalists, as I'll mention in just a second. 5 cities actually make up for about a third of last year's violence, and when you magnify that to the state level, we see a very, very high concentration of this violence. 70% actually of drug-related killings are found in just 80 of Mexico's 2,400 municipalities. So we're talking about very, very narrow zones of conflict here. Mexico City, no problem. Tijuana, even now, is not anything like it was back in 2008. It's a little bit difficult to see here in the graphic, but we've seen huge variation in Tijuana. It's almost back to pre-2006 levels. Whereas in Ciudad Juarez and Nuevo León and some other places, violence remains fairly severe. What happened in the last year especially is that new places in Mexico, new locations, became subject to higher levels of violence than ever before. We saw sudden spikes in places like Nuevo León, particularly in the city of Monterrey, in places like San Luis Potosí, Tamaulipas, Nayarit, places that previously had not been major battlegrounds for drug-related activities, suddenly became very, very violent. And what's happened this year, and there's been no officially government-released data on this as of yet for 2011, but the data that we used through the Reforma newspaper, which we track on a weekly basis, actually Kim Heinley, I think, is in the audience and is one of the folks that is responsible for our tracking efforts. What we see this year is actually that the violence has not it remains high, and it's quite possible that the level of violence for 2011 will exceed what we saw in 2010, which was itself the worst year on record. But what's interesting here to note, I think, is this yellow line, which represents 2011, is actually not much higher than 2010. And so the rate of increase in violence has actually slowed, and we may be at a turning point for Mexico in which the violence overall is plateauing and perhaps will start to decline. One of the other interesting things I'll point out is that we've seen a shift in the major battleground of the drug war right now in Mexico from Chihuahua, and particularly the city of Ciudad Juarez, to Nuevo León and the city of Monterrey. Monterrey actually displaced Ciudad Juarez as the site of violence, of sort of the epicenter of Mexico's violence over the last couple of months. And if that continues, it will probably register higher levels of violence than we have seen in Ciudad Juarez. And that's a good thing for Ciudad Juarez, obviously. We've actually seen about a 30% decline in levels of violence in Ciudad Juarez for a number of reasons I won't go into. But it's a bad thing, obviously, for folks in Monterrey, the business capital of Mexico. I've got about 2 or 3 more minutes, so I just want to point out that a couple of the other trends that are important to note here are, one, the types of targets are particularly important to note here. We've seen an increase in the number of government officials who've been targeted for violence. That includes not only elected officials, but also police and military personnel who have become victimized by this violence in recent years. And importantly, for the discussion this evening, the number of reporters who have become victimized by violence of various types, but in particular drug-related violence in recent years, has grown significantly and is, I think, one of the greatest concerns for the Committee to Protect Journalists and others. I rattle through these statistics very, very quickly, and it's very easy to pop through these numbers. 15,000 people killed last year, 40, 45,000, 50,000 people killed so far. I do want to remind us that these are people. Right? We're talking, even in the worst cases, even if you're a drug trafficker, we're talking about human beings who are losing their lives in horrendous violence, families that are, in communities that are being affected by this violence in the gravest of ways and in the most terrifying of ways. And, when it really hit home for me when I had the mixed fortune to arrive in Ciudad Juarez the day after a massacre of 15 people that included 13 kids under the age of 18, and got to go to the funeral procession for that massacre in Colonia Salvarcar. And when I got to watch a grandmother grieving over the casket of her grandchild, actually her twin grandchildren. And it's really incredibly sad. The worst sound that you can hear is a mother or grandmother grieving for her child, no matter what their circumstances were, whether they were a drug trafficker or just an innocent bystander. A couple of things, aggravating factors, I'll just mention very briefly. Of course, the Mexican government response to this violence has been to deploy the military and federal police to various locations throughout the country. We lost count after about 45,000 military deployments. The concern here is that some of these deployments have actually resulted in abuses by military personnel of the civilian population, and of course the suspects that they detain. On the issue of internal displacement, and then I will end here on my last minute, we have seen effects. Obviously, this violence is horrendous. It's scary. A lot of people internally are moving to other places. At last count, which was a report that came forward in March of this year, the Center for Internal Displacement Monitoring found that there are some 230,000 people displaced internally in Mexico. Now, not all of these are displaced as a result of drug-related violence. violence. In some cases, it's violence related to things as far back as the 1994 Chiapas rebellion. But a very significant portion of this violence is, of this displacement is concentrated in places like Chihuahua and Tamaulipas, where much of this violence, this drug-related violence, is occurring. One of the real interesting things that we've found looking at this, and here I point to some of the data that were gathered by one of our graduate students in the Masters in International Relations program over the last year in a joint project between the Transborder Institute and the Congressional Research Service. What we found in looking at actual asylum claims, interestingly enough, is that it's not really clear what's happening with the asylum claims. We do know that when you look at asylum applications from Mexico, they've actually remained relatively flat for the last few years. In the worst of the violence, they're actually lower than they were prior to the worst of the violence about 5 or 6 years ago. And the number of asylum claims granted for Mexico is first of all very different than the pattern we've seen for Colombia. It's basically been about flat for the last 10 years. And so this raises, I think, some interesting questions for our lawyers on the panel in terms of their experience in trying to reference the violence as a rationale for asylum claims. We know that, first of all, there are very narrow legal parameters for the use of asylum law as a basis for defending protection from deportation or affirmative claims to try to gain access to asylum, for which these victims probably would not qualify. You could make a tenuous argument perhaps for reporters on the basis of belonging to a particular social group. But we also see very significant variation across what judges, whether they're asylum judges or immigration judges, are willing to cede as a basis for not returning someone to Mexico. Some judges are very generous, and some judges are much less charitable of spirit in their interpretation of asylum cases. And the last is that one reason we may not be seeing this washout in the data on asylum, in addition to the other two claims that I've mentioned, is that asylum claims about violence may take place in a context other than asylum hearings, which is to say people in an immigration deportation hearing or in some other context may reference the violence as a rationale for why they would like to remain in the United States, and it doesn't show up per se in the asylum statistics. This obviously, these findings are actually, as I said, the result of the work of one of our students, Jamie Robb. She did a number of interviews with asylum judges and lawyers, and these are her general conclusions from that. I think we'll get a much clearer picture from talking to the lawyers on the panel of what's actually going on here. But thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the remaining comments.
And now I'd like to continue with Amy Isackson, who will give us her perspective from a journalist point of view who has been studying the border for a long time and going into the nooks and crannies of this area for a while.
So first, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Ginger and to Veronica for inviting me to participate. David did a good job of laying out the framework for the drug violence in Mexico, so you'll have to bear with me as I kind of cut things out here so as not to be too repetitive. But one of the most important points that David made as well is that not all of Mexico is Ciudad Juarez, and also even Ciudad Juarez, as David said, you can go there and come out alive. And especially if you're not involved in drug trafficking, that puts your odds down a bit. And what I mean by that is that Mexico, I think a lot of people, because the violence is so horrific, and because many people just don't know a lot about Mexico, there's a tendency to see Mexico and the drug violence there as more as kind of like a monolithic whole when it really isn't. And what I mean when I say that it isn't that all of Mexico isn't Ciudad Juarez, what I mean is that in all of the cities in Mexico, there aren't, piles of bodies dumped every day or people hanging from bridges. or heads found in trash bags like there are all too often in places like Ciudad Juarez. So academics like David have sliced and diced the death tolls over the years, and apparently on Saturday you can become part of that team if you would like to. But it's yielded some really interesting and important statistics, and I've picked out a few that I wanted to share with you. And that is that in 2010, 56% of the killings, the drug killings in Mexico, took place in just 4 of Mexico's 32 states. And those states were Chihuahua, Tamaulipas up on the Texas border, Sinaloa, which is on the west coast, and also Guerrero on the west coast, which is home to Acapulco. And I share that because it shows that it is pretty confined. Since 2007, 4 states account for 84% of the violence. And those states were Baja California, although that's changed, and I'll talk about that later, Chihuahua, Sinaloa, and also Guerrero. And the other point that I wanted to share is that in 2010, if you slice it down even closer, not to the state level, but to the municipal level, 70% of the violence took place in 80 of Mexico's more than 2,400 municipalities. And those included Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, Culiacan and Sinaloa, Acapulco, and Chihuahua. And if you go back even further to 2006, 72% of the drug killings were confined to 100 municipalities in Mexico. Now, turning to Tijuana for a moment, Tijuana is really a bright spot in Mexico's drug war. In 2010, there were about 800 homicides. That's now down so far this year, there's about half that, and we have 2 months more to go, and I don't want to knock on wood. Hopefully we're not going to reach it, the 2010 total. And also the violence in the last year for certain has taken on a very different tone. And it's largely been pushed to the eastern section of the city, and that's away from downtown and away from the Rio zone where we had been seeing big shootouts and very public displays of violence before. And it's also kind of gone more low profile. Gunmen have dropped their AK-47s and AR-15s, the big guns that were the cartel's weapons of choice, and are now more using handguns instead. And as I said, there haven't been big mass shootouts or multiple bodies dumped like there were in 2008 and 2009. And also, the police seem to be much safer there. There was a period where the police were just being attacked indiscriminately. I think there were over 40 policemen killed in Tijuana during that point, but they're not under attack like that now. Now, the reason why Tijuana has gotten better is up for debate. Part of it is that the former police chief, Julian Leizaola, who's actually now in Ciudad Juarez, did a lot to clean up the police force and just try to root out the corruption within the force. And also, in the last couple of years, 4 of the alleged perpetrators of the worst violence in 2008, and I'll go by their nicknames because you might recognize those more than the actual names, but El Teo, El Muletas, El Gordo Villarreal, and then just last week, El Cias, and those were 4 of the big warring guys, have been arrested. And that's helped squelch the violence quite a bit. But it is also widely believed that the Arellano Felix organization and that the Sinaloa cartel, who was moving in, have come to a kind of working agreement, and that the violence was just too expensive, both in terms of money and in terms of lives. And that took away from the real business of crossing drugs, so there was an agreement to stop that violence. Now, further east along the border, the state of Chihuahua, that's where Ciudad Juarez is, it's still the most violent, but it's also slightly a bright spot, as David suggested, that the murders so far this year are down to about 1,650 murders, which is still quite a bit and not really seen as positive, but it's an improvement over last year. One thing that's happened is that there's been a shift to Nuevo León, which is home to Monterrey, an important business center in Mexico, and that has had nearly 1,500 homicides so far this year, and that's a big increase compared to last year. Killings in Durango are also on the rise, and Veracruz is kind of a new front, which has gotten bad in the last few months, and there's been about 280 killings so far this year there compared to 39 of all of last year. And Veracruz is an interesting case, one, because it shows kind of the shifting nature of the violence and it moving into new territories, but also this kind of trend, I think, which is on the rise of splinter groups and these new mini cartels that have been developing. And one of President Calderon's ideas about cracking down on the drug cartels is that he was going to break up the big cartels into these manageable, smaller cartels that would then become more of a local, something that could be controlled more by the local police. So many of the latest killings in Veracruz are allegedly the work of a somewhat newish group called the Mata Zetas, or the Zeta Killers. And they say that they want to eradicate the Zetas and they're, you know, kind of like Robin Hoods in order to protect the people. And so I think that that's just an interesting example of that. So how does all of this affect immigration and asylum? Well, first, in terms of looking at people coming north, the drug violence has definitely affected people's thinking about making that trip. Over at UCSD at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies, Professor Wayne Cornelius and Professor David Fitzgerald go to communities in Mexico every year and interview people there about their thoughts on going north and migrating and what their fears are and what they think about. And over the years, they've done, I think, like more than 5,000 interviews. And so interestingly, in 2010, fear of crime in the Mexican border states became people's #1 fear of crossing. Previously, it had become the heat in the desert, the cold, not running out of water in the desert, the All-American Canal, the Border Patrol, things like that. But that has shifted, and for their interviews also in the beginning of 2011, the fear of border violence was #1. And this makes sense. Mexico's Human Rights Commission reports that more than 20,000 migrants were snatched in 2010. And there's strong evidence to show that drug cartels have become more involved in human smuggling operations during the last few years. Earlier this year, I'm sure you all remember the horrid stories last spring about a mass grave that was unearthed in San Fernando in the state of Tamaulipas, and that's just near on the Texas border. And many of the dead, I think there were over 200 people that were found in that grave, and many of the dead were believed to be migrants, and Mexican authorities believe that the Zetas are to blame and we're pulling them off buses, and the details still aren't very clear. And then the previous year, there were 72 people who were killed there who were also believed to be migrants. And here in Baja California, there's luckily no mass graves for migrants that have been discovered yet, nothing like that, but there have been a number of cases recently of migrants who are kidnapped for ransom. And what happens is that the kidnappers will call the relatives in the U.S. and try to get money out of them. And there's evidence that that's linked to, it's unclear whether it's really drug cartels or groups that are kind of affiliated with the drug cartels. And the violence, I think, on the northern border may have decreased the number of people who are coming north and crossing, but the number of people who cross to escape the violence in sort of a quasi-legal/illegal way using border crossing cards and tourist visas and also investor visas to flee the violence has increased, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But again, here in Baja California, it's very different, and the violence hasn't spurred as many people to go across. As David mentioned, there was a report by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center that puts the number of people displaced in Mexico around 230,000. and that's mostly in Chihuahua and Tamaulipas, again, over on the Texas border. And then there was a Ciudad Juarez research group in Ciudad Juarez that said about 150,000 people have fled the city to the U.S. Because of fears of the violence. And then that's not, I don't know how great that number is, because there are other groups that have estimated about 30,000. So it's up for interpretation and definitely is an area that can be studied more. And city officials in Ciudad Juarez estimate there are about 116,000 empty houses in the city now. Here in Baja, people began fleeing, I'd say, in around 2006 because kidnappings were on the rise. Again, there's no real systematic count, but the majority came to San Diego and lived here on their border crossing cards and on their tourist visas. And there are signs now that a lot of the people who did that are feeling safe enough, feeling that Tijuana is safe enough, that they are now moving back to Tijuana. Which brings me to my next point, is that some analysts, if you'll remember back in 2009, the former drug czar Barry McCaffrey, and also the U.S. military's Joint Forces Command, cited this potential threat that there were going to be just waves of migrants who were fleeing the violence, who were going to kind of invade the U.S., and that the U.S. was going to have to create refugee camps, et cetera. And most recently, there was a U.S. gang threat assessment that alluded to the same thing of people coming across. But I think if we look at the numbers, at least so far, the numbers tell a very different story. Of all the people displaced by the drug violence and infected by the drug violence along the border, only 3,200 asked for asylum last year, according to federal stats. And that's more than the total number from 2001 to 2006, but considering the number of people who have been affected, it's still pretty small. Now, even smaller is the number that were granted asylum. Of those 3,231, there were 49 last year that were granted asylum, and that's about 1.5%. And that's pretty much on par for the 4 previous years, just a tiny percentage. Now, as a reporter trying to use these numbers to get a picture of what's going on and where people are coming from and why they're fleeing, it's pretty difficult. The immigration proceedings are confidential, so it's nearly impossible, except anecdotally, to know why people left and where they fled from and what their lives are like in the U.S. And the federal officials won't give out information about why people fled Mexico, and they don't give out very specific information about where people ask for the asylum once they're in the U.S. And for example, last spring in a Mexican town called El Porvenir, which is about 50 miles east of El Paso, there was a drug group that hung up signs and said, if you don't get out, we're going to come through and kill you. And it was a town of about 3,000 people. Now, there were about 40 people that went to the border in El Paso and said they wanted to come to the U.S. and ask for asylum. Now, the way that the federal government gives reporters and other people those stats is to just say that those 40 were part of the El Paso sector. So just looking at the stats, that would never bear out that story, and you wouldn't say, oh, something happened in Fort Hancock. You would just look at it and think El Paso sector, unless, you know, luckily there are reporters there who published the story. One exception to this is border crossings. The federal officials do release more specific information about people who come to the border who ask for asylum actually at the physical border crossing. And they'll divide that out by sector. And federal government has the whole border divided into sectors. And for the San Diego sector, there's been a rise in the number of Mexican asylum seekers asking for asylum at border crossings here in the last 2 years. In 2009, it was 66. In 2010, it went up to 162, and this year, so far, it's about 172. And I find this interesting because the drug violence has diminished in Tijuana in the last 2 years, so it begs the question as to where those people are coming from and what's happening. Are we missing something in terms of what's happening with the drug violence in Tijuana that these people are coming here? The other thing that is interesting as well is that in talking with attorneys, immigration attorneys, It sounds like it used to be more that reporters who were covering the drug war and police, law enforcement officials in Mexico were the bulk of people who were asking for asylum. But it seems to have diversified, and now it's just ordinary people who have suffered kidnapping threats, death threats, who've had their businesses extorted, someone who's had multiple people in their family killed who come here. Another thing in terms of talking with immigration attorneys that stuck out to me is that they say that when people come to them and say, or call them from Mexico, and the people, their potential clients, have money or have means, that they will actually dissuade them from asking for asylum, even if the people think that that's what they want to do, because, as these three will tell us, the process of actually winning an asylum claim is so difficult. And I must tell you that Doug, his colleagues, speak about him like he is a god for having won one of these cases. So I'm excited to hear about the case that he had. So we're getting short on time. Another thing that I was talking about earlier is that there's been a lot of people, thousands of people all over the border who come to the U.S. fleeing the violence, not getting asylum, but doing it in other ways. And they come on tourist visas that allow them to cross the border, but then they stay longer than their tourist visas allow them to. Also on border crossing cards, which is a similar situation. And then a number of people who've been asking for investor visas. So if you invest, if you come up with a business plan and present this business plan to federal officials in the U.S., then you can set up this business if they think it's viable, and then you and members of your family can also get immigration status that way. Now, one of the difficulties in getting asylum and winning these cases, and I'll let them go into the nitty-gritty of it, but more on a top-line element of it is the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And if the U.S. started granting people from Mexico asylum in large amounts, that would basically, in effect, be the U.S. government saying that Mexico is incapable of protecting its citizens, and it would also show that the U.S. thinks that the government of Mexico is complicit in the abuse, and that the army and the police are involved in the abuse. And that could make for a very difficult situation between the U.S. and Mexico, and some analysts believe that that's why there's such a low percentage of asylum claims that are accepted here in the U.S. One final point is that with the attorneys that I've talked to in making their case, they talk about how they will just try to get as much evidence as they can, including media reports. And the media in Mexico and many parts of Mexico has just self-censored, and they don't report on a lot of the killings and drug violence that's happening there because they are scared. In the past couple years, there's been 38 reporters in Mexico who've been killed. So because the news isn't coming out, it makes it even more difficult for attorneys to be able to point to news stories and say, look, this is how horrible it is in such and such a town where this person came from, in order to be able to prove that case. And one last thing is that the Mexican cartels and the drug violence have been moving further into Central America, into countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And I don't want to sound like Barry McCaffrey, but I think that it would be a good idea in terms of looking at these asylum numbers to keep an eye on what's going on in Central America and in these countries to see if people are trying to flee there to the U.S. because of the drug violence as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Olivia.
Thank you. Can you hear us? If we just, okay, good, wonderful. All right, thank you so much, David and Amy. And I think they gave us a wonderful background that we can begin to sort of think about now the more specifically legal aspects of asylum. And we'll begin with Ginger Jacobs. Thank you.
So David left off his presentation with a really interesting question, which this side of the table is going to attempt to address. Why is asylum so scarce? And I think Amy touched on some of the reasons, and then I'd like to elaborate on what those reasons might be. Asylum is a benefit that's incredibly hard to get from within the United States. We hear about refugees, we see a lot of refugees, we see images in the news of these enormous refugee camps in Kenya, for example, with a lot of refugees from Somalia, from other countries who are being located to the U.S. through the United Nations. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about asylees. The UN hasn't gone into Mexico and declared massive numbers of people to have met the UN definition of a refugee. So the folks we're talking about are the ones who actually managed to make their way to the US-Mexico border, whether it's with some sort of lawful papers to enter the United States, and then they decide once they have entered lawfully to go about applying for asylum from within the United States, or whether it's people who just walk up to the border and present themselves to a Department of Homeland Security officer and basically say, hey, here I am, I'm scared and I'd like to apply for asylum. And then you could also have a situation in which somebody has entered the United States unlawfully, whether that's through the hills or hidden in the trunk of a car, and to at some point later in time decide that they want to apply affirmatively for asylum, which is just submitting an application, sending it in, and seeing what the asylum officers will do. Or alternatively, if they find themselves in deportation proceedings anyway, and then when the judge asks them, maybe for the first time, hey, do you have a fear of returning to Mexico? They say, as a matter of fact, I do. So these are several different contexts in which cases for asylum will arise. But the key factor is that the person actually has to be either within the U.S. or right knocking at the door of the U.S. to even be able to apply. So that may have something to do with why the numbers are so low. If folks are deep in central Mexico and it's very hard for them to get to the border, maybe monetarily or because of their fear of coming into territories that they perceive to be more violent, or if they are victims of violence themselves, as Amy referenced, the mass graves of migrants who are trying to relocate within Mexico. So it can be a very difficult challenge for, Mexico's an enormous country, for people to even come to the border in the first place, and it can cost quite a bit of money. Once an individual does come to the border and is seeking asylum, whether that's through an affirmative application or through the court, he or she will have to meet the legal test to show that they merit asylum protection. And this is where just being scared of violence doesn't cut it. And this is why I think you'll see, vast numbers of people who may be scared of something coming down to a very, very, very small number of people who actually get asylum. And I'd be really interested to know whether the 49 grants that Amy referenced were actually all individuals who are scared of narco violence, or if they were individuals who may have had claims for other reasons. For example, I've done some work through the IJP on cases of transgendered individuals who are afraid of bias crimes in Mexico. And so we don't know if those 49 are the folks that we're talking about this evening in terms of the cartel violence, or if they could have a completely different basis for their asylum claim. So I would imagine it's some subset of that number, so it's got to be a number even smaller than 49 of people who actually achieve asylum, and even more so why we revere Doug as a god, because he managed to get one of those through. So a refugee or an asylee is a person who is outside of their country of origin. So as I said, they actually have to get here first. They can't apply for this benefit from Mexico. And they are unable or unwilling to return because they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And that's a lot of different legal concepts that are contained within that one sentence. So I'm going to dissect it a little bit. The first thing that they have to show is that they have a well-founded fear. So they can't just be fearful or irrationally fearful. I might be afraid that if I go to Cancun on vacation, I'm going to get killed by a narco-trafficker. But I think David and Amy just indicated that that fear wouldn't be well-founded. That's not necessarily a realistic fear or one that could be substantiated with objective evidence. So just having the fear, the subjective fear of encountering some form of violence is not enough. It has to be a well-founded fear. So already when we look at the numbers about how there are these real hot spots for violence, but that the violence is not really spread throughout Mexico, that's going to be a really big challenge for somebody who's not coming from one of those specific hot spots or localities of violence. So the fear has to be well-founded. They have to fear a harm that rises to the level of persecution. Now, I don't think that that's an issue from the images that we saw and the types of crimes we've been discussing. If somebody is really specifically fearful of cartel or drug trafficking related violence, probably what they're afraid of is a harm that would be tantamount to persecution, because what we're seeing is that it's actually rising to the level of murder and torture and really hideous crimes. I think that many folks who are afraid of the narco-traffickers would have a problem with the on account of ground, which is that they have to show that their fear is on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. And I'll let Doug sort of tell his story of how he had the facts of his case fit into that. But if you're just an individual in the town of, you just mentioned it, and I have it in my information as well, but the town where the 30 people just walked up to the border and said, El Porvenir, and said, hey, there were signs in my town saying, that if we don't get out of town, we're going to be killed. Well, that's not really on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. It's more of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That doesn't mean that these people don't deserve protection, but they might not deserve a grant of asylum, because asylum is limited in its scope, and it's not for any person who's in any country of the world fleeing generalized violence. It's only for people who are fleeing specific types of violence. And if you look at the origin of the Refugee Convention coming out of World War II, you can kind of get a sense as to why it was designed and crafted the way it was to have the on account of grounds be rather narrow. And then another element that Amy referenced that I think is important is that in order to show that you have a well-founded fear of persecution, in order to meet the asylum standard, you have to show that the government in your home country is either unwilling or unable to control the people that you're afraid of. So either the government itself is going to persecute you, or a non-governmental actor could be the one persecuting you. But when we have President Calderon sending the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops throughout Mexico to try to put a lid on the violence, it's kind of hard to argue that the government's unwilling to do anything about it. You might be able to argue that they're unable to do anything about it, but I think that would take a pretty specific fact pattern. And I think that Amy hit on an interesting point with the concept of corruption diminishing. So I think some cases may have come about that would fit the governmental persecution if you had a corrupt police officer or a corrupt government official who was in bed with the narco-traffickers. You could then make an argument that even if this police officer was not engaging in illegal activities or persecutory activities on behalf of the government, that person has enough power as a government official for you to meet the standard of being afraid of either government violence or violence that the government's unwilling to control. So, you can maybe dance your way around all of these legal requirements, but it takes a very special case. And that's why I highly doubt that the 30 good people of Porvenir who came to the border are any of the 49 Mexicans who were granted asylum last year, because it's hard to imagine, unless there's a specific situation for one of those individuals where maybe specific members of their family were targeted for a very particular reason, or they received individualized threats that were very specific, just kind of signs up in the town saying, get out of town or you're going to be killed, is probably not enough to lead to an asylum grant. So that's the challenge we have with the asylum system in terms of trying to cope with this issue. And in fact, why, if I had an individual calling me from Mexico and saying, I just can't stand the violence anymore, I just can't stand the kidnappings anymore, I'm really scared, I would ask them if they wanted to start a business in the United States and get an investor visa, quite frankly, because it would be next to impossible for that person to get an asylum. And even amongst those of us who practice asylum law and are very passionate about it, you often will hear us say, let's try any other remedy first. Do you have an employer in the United States? Do you have a grandparent in the United States? You go through every possible means of legal migration. Asylum is the remedy of last resort. And so, if your potential client who's in Mexico has any other way of getting here legally, then you would not encourage them to apply for asylum. And the other thing, which Veronica's now going to address and talk more about, is if they just come to the border and ask for asylum, they're going to be detained. And the detention center is the equivalent of probably a moderate to high security jail. And so with that, I think it's the perfect time to hand it over to Veronica. But that would be a major disincentive for somebody to apply for asylum, particularly if they are a business owner in Mexico and they know they could just open a business here and get a visa. Why would they want to be put in jail first and apply for asylum and have to go about it in that way?
Should I just start?
Sorry.
Sure. Well, I'm going to talk about those people that don't have the money to start a business here in the U.S., unfortunately. I'm going to talk about the people that get to the border or get to the U.S. somehow, and how we're able to see them. Another obstacle is the lack of government-funded counsel here in immigration court, which I think a lot of people don't realize. There is no public defender in the immigration court. So if you want to be represented, then you have to pay for your attorney or find an organization that has the resources to help you in your case. And unfortunately, there are not many of those resources available here in the U.S. So you could also continue and represent yourself in court. If you think that you can do that and cover all these other obstacles in asylum, then great, but most of the time it doesn't happen. So I'm just going to talk about the Band-Aid that we are at the detention center here in San Diego. I'm with the Immigration Justice Project, and we provide a legal orientation to everyone that comes into the detention center. So we provide a Know Your Rights presentation to anyone that comes in so that they at least know what their rights are in court and what's going to happen when they go to court and what their defenses are, just the basics. We aren't attorneys there to serve every single person there. After that, we talk to them individually about their case if they're not represented and they would like to speak to us. So I'm just going to talk about what happens when the person gets to the detention center, just so that you know anyone that has any charges in immigration against them can be held at the detention center. So we see people that do make it to the border and ask for asylum. We see people that are in the U.S. and ask for asylum or ask for asylum or any type of relief when they're picked up here in the U.S. without status. And we also see people with status that have some charges brought against them, some immigration charges brought against them. So we see a number of those populations. Now, within that population, do we see people that say that they fear returning due to the violence in Mexico? Yes. We do see those people, but like everyone else said, we don't see the numbers that are being projected on TV every single day. So let's talk about those people. Let's say you make it to the border and say that you fear returning to Mexico due to the violence. What's going to happen to you? You're first going to go to an interview before an asylum officer. And during all of this time, you're detained, unless you're a very lucky person that gets paroled into the United States, allowed to enter into the United States while these proceedings are occurring against you. But most of the time, that does not happen. So you're detained, you go and see an asylum officer. That asylum officer, once they get to you, which might take some time, will sit with you and ask you a lot of questions about why you fear returning to your country. This happens with any person that makes it to the border and asks for asylum, no matter what country they're from. So they get asked all of these questions, and then they're returned back to their pod or their room, wherever they're staying. It's not a room. This is pretty much a jail, so their cell. They go back to their cell, and they wait and wait and wait for a response from that asylum officer. That can take weeks, that can take months. Then they come back to that same asylum officer to get a response. So that response can either be positive, yes, you've passed the credible fear proceedings, we believe that you fear, and so you're going to go see a judge now. Or they say, we don't believe that you have a credible fear, you're now going to go, you have two options. You can have the judge review our decision, or you can just go back to your country. So let's say that the person passed the credible fear. Now they get to go sit in front of a judge and actually ask for the asylum relief in front of a judge. Because at this point, they haven't entered an application, they haven't provided any evidence, no testimony has been taken. And so then they're going to go sit and wait for a hearing. Now, there's never just one hearing in front of the immigration court and everything gets decided. No. You probably will have many hearings. During all of these hearings, you will be detained unless you're paroled out of the detention center. Some people are very lucky, and luckily here in San Diego, people are being paroled or released out of the detention center while these hearings are going on against them. And if you are lucky enough to be released, then you go sit in front of an immigration judge that's not at the detention center. But those dockets are also very backed up. So you're sitting in this whole immigration process for months to years, more like years. And I see some people nodding because they know and they've sat or they've represented in these courts. And it's true, it's mostly years. Of course, in the detained process, they tried to make this go a little faster, but not much faster. So the person that has passed the credible fear is now asking for asylum, going in front of an immigration court. The person that hasn't then can go before the judge to decide, so that then the judge can decide if the asylum officer was correct or not. If the asylum officer says, no, I agree with the asylum officer, if the judge says, no, I agree with the asylum officer, then you're out of luck. If the judge says, no, I don't agree with the asylum officer, I'm going to vacate their decision, now you can go through the same process as everyone else and apply for asylum. So that's just for asylees. People that come to the port of entry asking for asylum. If you are already in the U.S. or you've made it into the U.S. and are now asking for asylum, you're just going to go straight to an immigration judge and start that whole process. And then Doug will let us know how what actually happens inside the court. But I'm just getting you to the court. So we are seeing these fears at the detention center. We are seeing people come to the port of entry. Lately, we've been seeing lots of larger groups, families, that come to the port of entry saying that they or someone they know has been threatened, and so they decided to come to the U.S. But those are, I think it takes a lot for those populations to get here, and it's usually a very horrible threat. No one comes to the port of entry thinking, I'm going to say that there's some violence going on around me. It's usually extortion that's going on in their hometown. Someone they know has been killed. There's been violence against them themselves. So there are claims, but those cases, a lot of them, other than the one that Doug has, are still sitting, and we're still waiting, wanting to know what's going to happen. But these immigration proceedings are so long that it's taking a while to try and figure out what the best strategy is or what's going to happen. Let's see. Just so that you know, this happens to all immigration attorneys, where we have to try and figure out what the best strategy is over and over, depending on the population. We've seen Haitians come in big waves, Somalis, Iraqis, and every time we have to try and figure out what's going on in that country in order to try and figure out how strong the case is going to be.
And I would add just that every time at the beginning we meet skepticism from the immigration judges, and it can take a few years to sort of get them to realize or see a trend or realize that there's something going on.
Right. And the people that we see at the detention center, like I said before, are people that don't have money for their own attorney most of the time. So a lot of the time they continue with an asylum claim, even if it's a very weak case, because they don't have an attorney guiding them through the process that's saying, you know, instead of sitting here for, you know, a year or two, this is not a weak case. This is a weak case. I don't think it's going to move forward. They don't have the benefit of having someone guide them through that process. And so a lot of the times they continue without knowing that at the end of the day, they might not be able to stay in the country, which is really unfortunate. Let's see. Some of the hard things to prove in these cases, as Ginger said, is the nexus, establishing that there is an association between your past persecution and the reason that you fear returning, and whether it's based on one of those 5 grounds. I know most of the time we argue these cases, we base it on a social group, and I know that I've talked to Doug before, and he's been able to prove political opinion, or at least made the argument. So we try, we really, really try, and at least make the argument when possible. And it's also, as some of you have mentioned before, it's hard to know who the perpetrator is, because it may be someone in a cartel, or it may be someone associated with a cartel. And a lot of the times, the victims aren't able to tell us exactly who it was. They know a nickname, they know, you know, it was the guy, someone related to someone that lived across the street from me. I can't present that in court, unfortunately, and have a judge believe that this is a credible fear. So it's really hard. Sometimes it's hard to gather evidence when a person back home does not want to send evidence to the U.S. because of the fear of what will happen to them in their home country. So there are a lot of obstacles for fighting these cases in court, but sometimes we are able to win these cases, whether it not be just straight asylum, but under withholding a removal or the Convention Against Torture. I think some of these cases are moving forward. And other types of claims, as Ginger mentioned, that we are seeing are LGBT cases from Mexico, people that fear returning because they are gay or transgendered. We are still seeing those claims coming from Mexico. Also, domestic violence cases, people that fear returning due to domestic violence in their home country, and people that fear returning due to their mental health concerns. And those are usually people that have lived in the U.S. for a very long time and are now in fear of being returned to their home country after all this time. There are options aside from asylum for those people that have been living in the U.S. for a long time and say, I fear returning. Now we try and find a family member that's a U.S. citizen or resident so they can apply for what's called non-LPR cancellation for someone that's lived in the U.S. 10 years or more and has a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident relative and fears returning because of how their U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident immediate relative will suffer. But that's also a very, very hard form of relief. But sometimes maybe a little bit easier than the asylum claim. And one thing that an attorney brought up to me today is that she was just in court, I think today or yesterday, and one of the trial attorneys, the government attorneys, instead of having them turn in an asylum application, asked them to hold off to see if the government would offer prosecutorial discretion, if the government might close the case just based on the positive factors in the case. So it sounds like something's happening. We don't know exactly what it is or how it's going to pan out, but we'll see. So with that, Olivia?
Thank you. And now we're going to have our dessert, someone who actually won an asylum case.
Well, by the way, let me preface by saying I'm not the only person who has prevailed in a crime-related or cartel case. Veronica recently prevailed in a very difficult case. I'm familiar with the facts of that case, and trust me, and I'm familiar with the client, a detainee, and trust me, it was a very difficult case, and she had a lot of obstacles to overcome, and she did so, and she won an asylum-related relief called Protection under the UN Convention Against Torture, because she was able to prove that that person would be tortured upon return to his country, Mexico. Let me give you a little bit of an introduction, then I want to discuss what I do as a private attorney, and then I want to give you a sample of one of my cases related to cartel violence. But I used to live in Mexico from 1986 to 1988. I lived in southern Mexico where I served a mission for my church. I lived on $68 a day, and that included rent, food, shelter, transportation, everything. I could have paid a lot more, but the idea was that we had to live like the people lived, and that meant that I was often in very bad neighborhoods. And we would finish service projects or meetings and leave at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and walk for miles through very bad neighborhoods. But I always felt secure. Maybe I was foolish, but there was a sense of security in Mexico, which I think has evaporated, whether it's real or not. That sense of security has evaporated. Interestingly, the most insecure moment I had in Mexico was in 1986 during the World Cup. Mexico was the host country. They were playing Germany, and of course everybody stopped everything they were doing to see the game, and Germany won. So everybody poured into the streets after the game, and I was walking along. I was the only 6'4" light-haired person on the street. And a drunk person pointed at me and said, "German, German." And we, and my missionary companion, had to run to escape these persons. So it was a very secure place. I still believe it is a secure place in most regions. If you don't believe that, turn on TMZ or Entertainment Tonight, and you'll see a Kardashian any night of the week vacationing in Cabo or some other part of Mexico. You could see that nightly. Now, what do we do as attorneys? A lot of people ask me, should I study law? Should I become an immigration attorney? And I put it to them this way. As attorneys, we take a person's worst problem and we make it our own. Because no one wants to go to an attorney unless they have to. And they usually wait until the last moment after the problem has become at its worst. And so that's what we do, and it's difficult. One of the senior judges who is now retired, who I clerked for in 1994, said, "Mr. Nelson, isn't this fascinating? We're not dealing with property lines. We're not deciding whose hedges are high or too high. We're not deciding insurance claims. We're deciding people's lives." And it is fascinating. But when you lose a case, it's devastating. When you see a father separated from his U.S. citizen children or his U.S. citizen wife because of a technicality or because of a poorly drafted law, and even where the judges want to help the person, they are unable to do so, you have to pick up the wreckage, and you have to discuss, the loss with the family as they cry for an hour in your office afterwards. So it is not easy work. And in fact, Survivors of Torture offers each year a counselor to speak to attorneys who have to deal with listening to cases of torture. I'm haunted by several of my cases of persons who were tortured in their country. And it's not easy, but when you win, it's a tremendous victory. It's so satisfying. The immigration attorneys are nodding their heads in here. We have a very good bench in San Diego of judges. It's like what I consider probably the model court in the United States. As compared to other jurisdictions, it's just the best. They are thoughtful, and they want to afford the asylees and every opportunity to present their claim. as compared to a couple of years ago in Miami, where one judge would deny 90% of the asylum cases he saw, and another judge would grant 90% of the cases she saw. It was luck of the draw, whereas here the judges are more even and I think rather fair. As a private practitioner, we regularly receive phone calls from Mexicans who want to seek asylum. We're used to dealing with these issues. They're difficult cases. As stated before, maybe 1.4% of the cases have success. It all comes down to nexus, nexus, nexus. Yes, they've been persecuted, but that persecution wasn't on account of their race or their religion or nationality. It wasn't on account of their membership in a particular social group, and it wasn't on account of their political opinion. So you can have a victim of horrible persecution from Mexico, but he simply does not qualify because he doesn't fit within one of those 5 grounds. And merely trying to extract money from a person is just insufficient in order to meet one of those 5 grounds. I have done Colombian cases. Years ago, I did several Colombian cases, and I think the difference between those cases was there's often a political aspect to the Colombian cases. The cartels were powerful. Some of them had a political bent to them. Some of them employed communist guerrillas, and so it was easier to establish one of the 5 grounds, the nexus. Whereas in Mexico, the cartels have not become as political as the Colombian cartels. And so you have to find some other way in order to prevail. I have done domestic violence cases from Mexico, as many of my colleagues have, and prevailed. Very tricky and difficult cases because it's hard to prove that they would suffer nationwide. What you often hear is if you've got a problem in Tijuana, move to Cancun. It's a big country. You can escape your problems. We've done homosexual cases, but we fear that those are going to begin to wane in the future because Mexico is becoming more progressive, and there are even laws in the books in Mexico City which allow gay marriage. I believe those are still in the books. Transgender cases are still very strong cases from Mexico because the person simply can't run from who they are. And they present unique challenges because oftentimes they suffered terrible abuse as children. They couldn't find no quarter anywhere, no safe place. They fall into drugs, and they sometimes commit crimes. And so persons who have done those cases know that they have special challenges because they have often a criminal background. But there are also very strong cases because many of them face a very real fear of torture or harm if returned to their country. Let's talk about my case. Maybe it's been a little overblown, but I'm going to tell you the facts, and then I've changed some of the facts because although my client has given me his consent to discuss the case, and I specifically called him before I came here today, I really don't want the facts to get out. I've changed some of the facts. They don't alter the claim. They just, how long he was detained and when exactly and by whom. I've changed some of that. But let me tell you about that. So my client's mother was a successful businesswoman in Tijuana. And she worked with her adult son in this business. Her particular industry was targeted by a very large cartel for threats. They were trying to take a quota from her every month, a protection fee. She refused. Nearly all of her colleagues had conceded and started paying this fee to the criminals, but she refused. So after several months, instead of attacking her, what they did was they kidnapped her son, her adult son. Now, he was going to work early in the morning, and that's where he was kidnapped. And we have the surveillance camera photo stills from the surveillance camera. And it was quite gripping because he's a good and decent young man. I got to know him very well. And you look at these photographs, and you see in the one photograph, he's walking near the building. In the next photograph, there's a Mercedes behind him and men running from the Mercedes. And the next still, He's like this, by the way, in a complete panic. And the next frame, they're on top of him. And the next frame, they're dragging him to the car. And the next frame, they're stuffing him into the car. And in the next frame, they're gone. Well, he was detained for, I won't give you the exact figure, but about 9 days, during which he was tortured. He was chained to a bathroom, had to live on the floor, dirty conditions, barely fed, abused and beaten, and repeatedly threatened. He spoke to his mother on the telephone, he spoke to the police on the telephone, and they were trying to negotiate a ransom. And he also listened to all the conversations that his criminal captors were engaged in. For example, they would hang up with the police negotiator, and then they would immediately take another phone call. And whoever was on the other line of that phone knew exactly what was said in the negotiation. And they were working with the criminals. And it became apparent to my client that the police were 50-50. They were working both sides. And he was lucky to be released after 9 days. They took him to the beach. They said, walk 50 paces, don't turn around or we're going to shoot you. He did as he was told to do, got into a taxi, and was able to make it home. He was lucky to have a visitor's visa, and he and his mother came to first, before they came to the United States. A few days after the kidnapping ended, after the ransom had been paid, he was, the police called him and his mother and said, please come to the police station, we want to take another statement. They walked into the police station, and the kidnappers were there, sitting in the police station. And the mother and the son were paraded in front of them. And it was clear that they wanted to see each other, right? I mean, that the police wanted them to see each other. And my client complained, the mother complained, and afterwards they left, and they received another phone call from a good officer who said, you got to leave, because the kidnappers have been released from our custody. And so they picked up their belongings, they took their visitor's visas, and they came to the United States. Now, he first contacted a capper. He didn't know any different. And the captor referred him, a capper is a non-attorney who refers cases to attorneys for money, which is unethical and illegal. But he referred him to an attorney in Los Angeles, and the attorney in Los Angeles prepared the case and passed the case between several different associates of his. And every time my client would call, he would, his attorney, he said, oh, you have a new person in charge, or the last attorney was fired, or the last attorney's been reassigned. And when my client showed up for his asylum interview, which was conducted at the Anaheim Asylum Office, an attorney walked in and shouted his name, and he responded yes, and that's the first time they had ever met, and they walked into the interview together. Well, the officer believed his claim 100%. He testified credibly. But again, it came down to nexus. It wasn't on account of his race or religion or membership in a social group or politics. And frankly, his prior attorney completely missed the issue, didn't even address the 5 grounds of eligibility. So he was denied asylum, but he was referred to the immigration court, and that's when I became involved. I was confronted with a problem, because my client was offering up this information without me asking, but offering up information that proved a nexus, proved that he did qualify for asylum and or its related reliefs. How do I add that information without making it look like I'm embellishing the claim or exaggerating the claim? You know, credibility is king. You got to keep your client's credibility. And so I typed verbatim the old application, then in italics I made all these changes of the new information that I had received, because I felt it was my duty that if I did not include it, then I wasn't doing my job correctly. And attorneys can have second opinions, and I argued with the judge saying I had a second opinion, and these are the facts that I elicited from my client. And the judge, he testified before the judge, and the judge found him 100% credible. Now, what was my argument to get him into one of the 5 grounds of eligibility? Now, notice that only the son applied. The mother had not applied because she wanted to establish a business, and she was in the process of establishing a business here. She was a successful businesswoman. And we had recommended that too. But the son didn't have those resources. And by the way, he was already caught. You know, so often we have to decide, well, do we want to turn this person into the asylum proceedings? Because if we do, they lose their visitor's visa. I mean, when you declare that you want to remain in the United States indefinitely, they're not going to give you a temporary visitor's visa after that. And if you don't prevail on your asylum claim, the person is really stuck. Well, my argument was the mother, had she applied for asylum, would not qualify because she was a direct victim of a crime, and we don't protect every victim of crime. Crime exists in the United States, it exists all over the world. But I said, the reason that they took this man was because of his family relationship to the mother. They didn't take the neighbor. They didn't take another employee. They didn't take another manager at the company. They took the son because they wanted to exploit that relationship. And had he not been related to her, he never would have been kidnapped. The judge was entertained by the argument. He enjoyed it very much. Yeah, and, we had briefed it, and the government, of course was opposed. And the judge, he gave us an indication of where he was probably going to go without making a final decision. The judge believed that my client was deserving of protection under the UN Convention Against Torture. Now, in order to prove that, you have to meet a much higher burden than you do for asylum. In asylum cases, it can be as little as a 10% chance of future harm is enough in order to allow you to win the case. 1 in 10 chance could be a well-founded fear of return. Whereas under the Torture Convention, you've got to prove that it's more likely than not that you would be tortured upon return to your country, and the torture has to be at the acquiescence of the government or committed by the government. Because my client credibly testified that the government was involved with his kidnap and with the negotiations, and they're working both sides of the fence, and because we had a lot of material to show that the police can be corrupt in Mexico, the judge did find that it was more likely than not that my client would suffer torture upon return. But when it came to asylum, the judge seemed to lean against us, and most of the argument for 30 minutes was about a back and forth between me and the judge and the prosecutor, the government attorney, was about nexus and, what was the one central reason. That's what the law requires, that we prove that the one central reason for the harm was based upon one of the 5 grounds. And he was a bit skeptical. He didn't quite want to stretch the law that far. So we had a break, and I met with my client. I said, listen, you're going to get torture convention. And I've negotiated with the government during the break that they will not appeal a grant of torture convention protection. You can go to the higher courts if the judge denies asylum, but the next highest court is the Board of Immigration Appeals, and they're rather conservative. Okay, they follow all the other circuits, not the Ninth Circuit generally, and they're just more conservative, and the likelihood of success at the board is practically nothing. But then you would get to the Ninth Circuit, which is generally a liberal court. Now, 5 years ago, I would have been very comfortable in taking this case to the Ninth Circuit, but in the last couple of years, we've received some terrible decisions from the Ninth Circuit, and it's undermined our faith that it's as liberal as we used to think it was. But ultimately, my client said, the risk is too great. I'm going to take the deal that's offered. I don't want to appeal. I want to be safe. And so we accepted protection under the UN Convention Against Torture. And now he lives here. He's safe here. He has a work permit. He has to report to the authorities regularly. But he has the opportunity to establish a life here because the government will not return him to Mexico unless it can prove that it's safe to return, and that may never happen in his particular circumstances. Also, he's quite an eligible bachelor. He'll probably get married to a U.S. citizen. And even though there are restrictions as to how long we're given in order to reopen a case, and those periods of time have elapsed, I've seen that in these types of cases where you can't return somebody to their country, the government is willing to work with us and reopen these cases despite the filing deadlines. With the acquiescence of the government, we can reopen these cases and adjust their status and ultimately obtain a green card. So he has that very real possibility in the future. So that's the latest case that I've done related to cartel violence. And I know some other practitioners probably have some similar experiences. I hope this has given you a better understanding of what I do and what others have done. I don't expect to see a flood of persons coming to the United States seeking asylum from Mexico, because the word is getting out as to how difficult it is to prevail. And you know, as I said, even the mother of my client, in my opinion, even though she received direct threats from the cartel and witnessed her son, well, I should say, went through the experience of having her son kidnapped for 9 days and tortured, she probably would not prevail. Very unlikely that she would ever prevail. So that is how the law is working in my experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank all of our guests on the panel right now, and then I would like to open the room up for discussion and questions. I mean, there have been a lot of things that have come up in the time that we've been here. So if there is a question, anybody? I know we have a lot of lawyers in the room.
Do I do other types of cases besides asylum? I used to do a much wider field of cases, but I've been narrowing it over the years, concentrating mostly on court cases and family immigration. I no longer touch business visas. Business visas used to be wonderful, and it's been ruined, not by law, but by a change in personnel. And as the Supreme Court once said, this is the second most complex area of law after tax, because it's so political. And it's a very difficult area, so I've narrowed my focus.
We have an organization, Border Angels, and we work with a lot of the migrants crossing the border. And I was really appreciative of the comments about how safe it is in Mexico, and there's some exceptional areas. But I was hoping that maybe we can get some numbers. When you mention how many homicides there are, you could compare it to a comparable city of that same size in the United States. That would be very helpful, I think, and it'd be helpful to me. And then the other one was, as you know, the overwhelming majority of the people that are coming because of economic reasons, followed by family reunification. So the narco violence is way down the line. And the numbers have dropped dramatically because of the economic situation in the United States. And two specific questions. Right now we're dealing with a case, and I'm not an attorney, we're dealing with a case of a Honduran man. And I know you guys are all great attorneys. I see Carmen Chavez, another great attorney over there. But in this case, this attorney that represented this Honduran man didn't speak Spanish very well. And he didn't get a translator till the very end, and the young man, as a result, is in process of deportation. So we're going to protest that this Monday at 12 noon in front of the federal building. Is there recourse for this young man where he can say, to whomever, hey, wait a minute, I was misrepresented? That's one. And then you mentioned something, Doug, that really concerned me a little bit. I had never heard the phrase captor or capper or something like that. And I refer people to attorneys all the time. And so I want to make sure
very different.
I'm not doing
very different.
I've been accused of doing illegal things, but never that one. And so I just want to make sure that that's okay, because we do refer people, since I'm not an attorney and people call us about various issues, we refer. So the one is the recourse for the Honduran man, and the other one, as far as referring, I guess that's fine.
On the first point, if you look at a place like Ciudad Juarez, where we've seen an extraordinary number of homicides. Last year it was over 2,200, over 2,400 homicides. That's such an extraordinary number. There is no U.S. city that compares to that. You'd have to take Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, the top 10 cities combined to come anywhere close to that. It's so above the pale. We're talking a homicide rate of over 120 or 140 per 100,000. It's beyond. It's 5 times what the World Health Organization considers epidemic levels of homicide. So you have cases like that are extreme, and they're very, very few. But the average homicide rate in Mexico is about 18. According to the latest government data, 18 per 100,000 population nationwide, which is about double, or maybe 2.5 times the. Closer? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Verizon, hello? Oh, it is? Do I have to do something here? Did I do something naughty?
On the top, I think.
Oh, wow. I didn't know I did that. Sorry. This is a religious institution. Thank you. So the numbers of homicides in Ciudad Juarez are many, many times greater than what we see in most U.S. cities, and it's actually quite a bit more than several of the top U.S. cities combined. But then you have a national homicide rate of people are estimating about 18 per 100,000 in Mexico, which is maybe 2.5 times what we see in the United States. And that, compared to a place like Gary, Indiana, where you might see 30 or 40 homicides per 100,000, is significantly less. You're certainly a lot safer in some parts of Mexico than you would be in the United States. And if you're an American citizen, I mean, the number of American citizens killed last year in Mexico was something like maybe 140 or 150. That's significantly more than the year before and the year before that. But still, there are probably 1 million U.S. citizens in Mexico, so there's 140 of those that got killed. Your chances of being killed in a homicide in Mexico may be lower than in many places in the United States. So it's all about sort of how you play with the statistics.
To the second question about whether an individual has recourse if they received inadequate representation, the answer is yes. A case can be reopened if the individual basically files a bar grievance against the attorney who mishandled the case in the first place under a case. It was called In Re Lazada, and so we sort of shortcut it in the immigration bar, and we'll say, oh, you have to Lazada somebody to try to get the case reopened, which means that the client has to file a bar grievance, and then they have to file a special motion to reopen their case before the last jurisdictional body that had heard the case. So that might be either the Board of Immigration Appeals, if that's the last place where the case was heard, or the immigration judge, if the case was never appealed. And I would recommend trying to work proactively with the Department of Homeland Security. Doug had mentioned that sometimes they're amenable to working with you when there's a particularly sympathetic case. So approaching the Chief Counsel's office, explaining the facts of the case, and seeing if they might even be willing to join a grievance or a motion to reopen that's based on a grievance. Another thing that's happening now, and we touched on this very briefly, Veronica touched on this, there's a new trend that has come about since the summer when John Morton, who's the director of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, released a memorandum saying we have certain deportation priorities in this country, and people meeting, a list of 10 to 12 criteria are not high priorities for deportation, and these other folks who meet a different 10 to 12 criteria are priorities for deportation. We're starting to see a lot of movement now where the Department of Homeland Security is willing to either permanently terminate or temporarily terminate the deportation cases against individuals who are not high priorities for deportation. So if the individual in question has no criminal history, is a person of good moral character, if they have a lot of equities in their favor and no negative equities, then it might be worthwhile to approach the Chief Counsel's office to see if the case can be terminated. So there are a variety of remedies for somebody who has been harmed in that way. And what Doug was referring to that is an illegal practice is a non-attorney receiving money for a referral to an attorney. So a non-attorney can certainly refer someone to an attorney, help them get appropriate legal help, but they can't take any sort of a kickback or monetary compensation for that. So I'm sure you're fine.
We love referrals.
It does, but I think that the most effective remedy is to have appropriate counsel who can then get in and sort of re-lawyer the case in the most effective way.
Yeah, it has, contacting congresspersons has zero effect on the immigration court, zero. The judges don't listen to congresspersons. And so they're very good at maintaining that distance, but it does have influence in the government attorney's office.
Yes, a couple.
I had a question here. Actually, I had two. One of you made the comment about the only way you can seek asylum is if you're at the border or you've crossed the border and then are detained or apprehended. I thought, and this is probably watching too many Bourne movies, but I thought you could go to a U.S. embassy in, like, Mexico City and seek asylum there. Is that not possible?
I think that was me, and I was just talking about the people that we see in detention are people that have either come to the border or are stopped and aren't put into proceedings. But you can apply affirmatively. If you are already in the U.S., you can apply for asylum. I don't do any outside of the U.S. work, so I wouldn't.
The person would not meet the definition of a refugee or asylee because they have to be outside of their country of origin in order to qualify.
So it's to avoid return to the country as opposed to being in the country and trying to get out of the country.
Exactly. So you can't, you wouldn't be able, I mean, I've heard of this as sort of a hypothetical, and I have seen cases where the history indicates that the person has tried it to go to the U.S. Embassy in their country of origin, but I've never seen that actually be successful. And I think a big part of the reason is just that, you know, the expectation is that they would have already left. Like, if they were that scared, they would have already left somehow.
Except they have to get to the border.
Well, right.
I had another question quickly. The data you showed indicated on one of the slides that the violence had escalated, and you made a comment that it appeared to may have peaked and may decline, but the level that it's at now, if it were to stay there, is still somewhat extraordinary and certainly would be cause for people to have fear.
Absolutely. Even if it's plateaued, we're talking about a level of homicide that's much greater than what we saw 10 years ago in Mexico, and it would be, I think, pretty devastating if we saw a continuation. I think the hope, though, is that as the violence appears to be maxing out, perhaps it could show a decline over time. It's a very, very tentative opinion, but the fact that we're not seeing double-digit annual increases in the number of drug-related homicide, the percentage increases in drug-related homicides, I think could be promising compared to what we'd seen in the past. The rate of increase was so steep in 2008, 2009, and 2010. The fact that things are starting to level off means that there's some kind of change in the direction of the violence, perhaps. You want to do a follow-up real quick?
One of the reasons the violence may have decreased in Tijuana is the fact that the cartels have actually reached an agreement to work together as opposed to fighting each other, which isn't necessarily a good
That's not exactly winning.
outcome.
Yeah, no. And I think that's one of the big problems is, you know, we've gone through all of this. We've seen tens of thousands of lives killed, and many thousands more destroyed. And at the end of the day, when you look at the toll of violence and the toll of destruction in Mexico, you have to ask, what has it all been for? Has it made Mexicans any safer? Has it made it any more difficult for people in the United States to get access to drugs and the dangers that they may represent? And if the answer is no, it's a terrible tragedy, I think, for Mexico. And it's a pattern of violence and a ballooning of violence from one place to the next that has been going on for at least 40 years in Latin America. So it's a pretty sad situation.
I'd just like to add one thing about violence in Mexico, and that is there are some people who are more vulnerable than others. And so we're talking about more vulnerable or risk-prone areas and cities. Well, there are also populations within these cities, groups of people who are more exposed to violence. And that has always been the case, of course, in many parts of, throughout Mexico, throughout Latin America. But what we've seen, for instance, in Tijuana, is that those kind of high-profile violence definitely is not there the way it was, for instance, in 2008. And yet, in many of the peripheral communities, there is still a lot of low-gauge kind of violence. All right, so robberies, holdups, and of course other kinds of violence like domestic violence, which is on the rise, and violence against women. So if we can say this is not the you know, obviously the media is not interested in posting these every day, but this is also a consequence of something that is happening in Mexican society, which is you know, violence of different sorts it is still very much a part of the country, and it's rampant, and it's affecting many people. Women, who happen to be sort of my group of interests, are really a target group throughout Mexico, and also in Central America. We're seeing an increasing violence against women. How this is related to everything else that's happening, well, that's something for us to, you know, research and discuss.
Yeah, actually, my question is related to that, because there's also a lot of violence in Mexico's southern border, and it's also related to drugs because they have all this illicit trafficking and smuggling in southern border, and especially with Central Americans. So you think that violence had affected actually the Central American flows to the U.S. because they need to cross. They crossed through Chiapas, they crossed to Veracruz, they use the train, and that is something that we don't actually hear much, but it's happening.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, that was my original research, which was to look at human rights and the risks that immigrants from people that face from Central America who cross the southern border and try to get through Mexico, which is a very, very treacherous terrain for them. To come to the United States, to cross the border in the northern and between Mexico and the United States. And yes, of course, that is a border that has been forgotten. It was for a long time invisible. And we are seeing, because of these high-profile kinds of crimes, like San Fernando, now a new spotlight has been placed on Central American immigration. But I think, as you also pointed out, David, is that Central America is also now an area where a lot of cartels are very interested in, Amy. And I think this is going to be something, again, that we have to begin to look at. And again, just to underline my issue, violence against women. Whenever you have generalized violence, an upswing in generalized violence of any sort, women are going to be very, very, very soon victims as a group.
I've got two questions that are sort of related. Most of you have described various facets of the topic that's on the screens. In general, are you seeing is there an actual not perceived, but an actual shift in government policy and behavior with respect to the title tonight? Is immigration policy moving and changing because of the violence that David's been describing? And if so, where is it moving? What are you seeing? Because I'm having difficulty as somebody who's working with a family in this situation, getting accurate information. I mean, you hear one thing and then you're told something different. And I'm hearing, I think government policy shifting, but I can't read anything on that that's official. So that's one question. The second question was something that you brought up, Ginger, when you mentioned cases, if you go and appeal to, I don't know if you said chief counsel, and cases are terminated. What does that mean, and what are those people's status? Is that a good thing to have your case terminated? Okay. What's it look like on the other side of that doorway?
Right. So those are really great questions. I would say in terms of is policy shifting, Veronica had just circulated to us a really massive article entitled Mexico's Narco Refugees, the Looming Challenge for U.S. National Security, that was put together by the U.S. Army. And so I think that this is an issue that the U.S. government is increasingly looking at and is concerned about. And the recommendation in this piece, which is just the author's own recommendation, is that if the U.S. is sort of too open to narco refugees, then there could be a floodgate effect. But if, on the other hand, they completely shut it down and don't entertain these claims, that they could be in violation of international law. So I think that the government is still trying to sort of figure out what the balance is going to be between the floodgate effect and between upholding their obligations under international law. It's interesting that we've been talking about Central America, because I've actually seen a much greater flood of asylum applicants from Central America than from Mexico. And a lot of those individuals are victims of a different kind of gang-related violence. And I guess that would be the MS-13 and the Calle 18 gangs. And I'm guessing that the connection with narco trafficking, and maybe Amy can address this, is perhaps that the narco cartels in Mexico are getting linked up with the gangs already on the ground there. But the case law has been developing in such a way that it is virtually impossible for these people to get asylum, because they're saying, being forced into a gang or being threatened that you're going to be killed if you don't join the gang. There's no nexus. Even when we come up with all kinds of really creative arguments about refusing to join a gang is a political opinion, it's an anti-gang political opinion or an anti-violence political opinion. I mean, it's an uphill battle, and it's one we're losing. And so if the Mexican cases are going to start hitting the same case law walls that we've been seeing with the Salvadoran cases and the Central American cases, I don't see much of a silver lining on this. The silver lining is there with the prosecutorial discretion. I think that's a great question. What this means is that if you are in removal proceedings, so this does not apply to the general undocumented population who's not in any kind of deportation proceeding. If you are in removal proceedings and if you meet a certain set of criteria, you can ask for a joint motion to terminate your case, to just terminate proceedings altogether, but you return to whatever status you were in before, which for most of these folks is going to be completely undocumented. So the upside is they get to stay here in this country where they're safe from maybe violence in their home country, or where they're with their family, or they're with their U.S. citizen kids who are in high school here, or whatever the factors are that make them want to be here. The downside is they're not making any progress towards legalization. So they're not getting any kind of work permit. They're not getting any kind of benefit that would allow them to stay here lawfully in a documented status long term. The government knows about them. They may have to keep checking in with an ICE officer from time to time. They're essentially on probation, more or less. The government knows where they are. They have to update their home address, their employer's address, their lawyer's address. I mean, they basically have to leave a credit card for all intents and purposes. But it's sort of a temporary reprieve from actually being deported. So I see it for certain clients of mine as a huge benefit. I mean, I have folks who are coming in who have no valid asylum claim. They have no relatives in the U.S. with lawful status. They have nothing in terms of a remedy, and we're getting their cases terminated. So maybe it's not a long-term solution. If the policy change, if the winds change in Washington, if there's a new administration at some point that has a different policy, they may lose whatever ground they gained by having the case terminated, but at least for the moment, they're here, and I don't think it's insignificant. I have a client I'm working with right now who we just got administrative closure for, so that was a temporary closure of his case, and he said, "Does that mean I'm going to be here at Christmas?" And I said, "Yes, it is," and he started crying. And so it's not nothing. So I'm a big proponent of where this policy is moving. I just hope it lasts.
One quick observation. I mean, I would just say we're not actually seeing a change in U.S. Asylum law. We're not seeing any specific policy changes in that regard. What may be shifting is the opinions of judges or immigration authorities with respect to this, but there's no concrete changes yet. I mean, one question, and this is sort of a common question, I mean, one option for policy change might be to move to allow for temporary protected status, right, for Mexicans fleeing from drug violence. That is not, as far as I know, a measure that anyone has moved forward in terms of legislation, but it could be a way of modifying our existing immigration laws. The reality, though, behind this is the politics of immigration in the United States, particularly with the case of Mexico, are such that it would be very, very hard to make that case, I think, as a policy matter, because it is not only the source of our largest number of legal immigrants, but also because it's it is the largest source of undocumented immigrants, and that, I think, really complicates the prospects for Mexican asylees or victims of violence who'd like to come here.
I think temporary protected status would be politically infeasible because in order to designate a country for temporary protected status, our State Department reaches an agreement with that country's government. So Mexico would actually have to agree to it. And that would essentially be a confession that their war on drugs isn't working. So I don't see that as actually being a likely development.
If I can add an example of temporary protected status, just so you understand what these words mean. When Haiti had its terrible earthquake, the United States granted Haitians temporary protected status, meaning that if you were here on the date that that earthquake happened, we're not going to send you back. We're going to give you a work permit, and we'll give you this temporary status until it's safe or viable to return. And we've done that for several other countries, many Central American countries, some African countries, and most recently Haiti.
That's a good segue into my question. And Amy, you might be the best one to answer this question because it has to do with the role of media and immigration policy. And working with Haitian refugees last year, and it seemed like asylum cases, aside from the temporary protected status, asylum cases for Haitians seemed a lot more fluid, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to piece together why that might have been, and it seems like maybe sympathy in the United States for the plight of Haitians because of this natural disaster may have had a role in kind of changing immigration policy to allow for more asylum cases of Haitians. And I'm wondering what the U.S. Kind of atmosphere in the general population regarding the conflict in Mexico and a lot of the violence there and a lot of the migrants that are coming up and how that might affect immigration policy in regards to the number of asylum cases being granted.
In terms of, the question is in terms of media coverage in the U.S. of migrants from Mexico and how that might affect asylum? Is that, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking.
Seems like there was a lot more sympathy to Haitians after the earthquake, and that might have led to a lot more asylum cases being granted. And I'm wondering if the general atmosphere about Mexican migrants in the United States might be affecting immigration policy.
I mean, I think in one sense the law is the law, and I don't know that media coverage is going to change these laws in terms of asylum that have been on the books for a very long time. But I think that media coverage in terms of immigrants from Mexico is, it's often quite inflammatory. I think that immigration from Mexico, as we know, is a really inflammatory political topic. And so none of those things in terms of covering economic migrants and a lot of the inflammatory coverage of economic migrants benefits, people who might be coming to the U.S. for other reasons. Also, I think that because it's drug violence, I think that there is a sense that you have to go even further to prove yourself and prove that you aren't part of that drug violence once you do get to the U.S. Because I think, sadly, there's kind of this vision that, many people in Mexico are part of the cartels and are drug people and killers and somehow involved in trafficking in that way. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I don't know if you all have comment on that.
I have an anecdote about that because just before the earthquake, I filed 9 asylum applications from Haiti in November, December, and January before the earthquake. They all belonged to the same group. They had all been persecuted by the same police force, and they all had great corroboration. Before the earthquake, 2 were denied and referred to court. 2 were granted, and then the earthquake happened, and 5 were granted. So did it have an influence on thinking? Not on policy, but it had an influence, I believe, on the thinking of the officers, that they just, if there was a claim there, they would just grant it because it was so horrendous what had happened in Haiti.
I would agree, and I think that anecdotally from the immigration judge's perspective, I mean, we live so close to the border and it's such an integrated community that I think the judges here tend to think, oh, it's not so bad. You know, I've got my vacation house in Rosarito, or I love to go to Cabo and sail, and so they don't tend to necessarily realize that there can be vast disparities amongst different areas in Mexico and amongst the circumstances. I mean, there are certain judges who are notorious for saying, well, I don't understand, why don't you just go to Cancun and get a job in a hotel? You speak both English and Spanish, you'd be just fine. I mean, well, we can't take all 400,000 people who are currently in immigration court proceedings and send them to get hotel jobs in Cancun. It's just not realistic. But I think because we are right on the border, there's such a familiarity that many of the judges and officers have with Mexico in a positive way, that they sometimes don't take hardship claims very seriously from people who are in very different circumstances.
I think also to the extent that the coverage of the drug war in Mexico is inflammatory and builds up this perception that there's going to be a wave of refugees or wave of people who come across and ask for asylum, in terms of influencing immigration judges, that could make them be harder on those cases in some ways, because they don't want to let it be known, open the floodgates and let it be known to people back in Mexico that you just have to come to the border and ask for asylum and then you're good to go.
And if I can add about Haiti, right after the earthquake, or right as the earthquake happened, no one knew how many cases were coming. Now, as it's getting further from the earthquake and we've had lots more Haitian asylum cases coming, I think the judges have become a little more difficult in granting those cases, and a lot of people have decided just to apply for TPS instead of going forward with their asylum claims. And just from the nonprofit point of view, we're trying to place these cases, and it's very difficult because they are weak cases, unfortunately, because as we know, the asylum laws are so difficult.
Well, we have run out of time, and I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and to thank our panel. And I would also like to mention 3 people who are not up here, but who have been helping in the organization of tonight's discussion. That is 3 of our assistants, Amy Callahan, Lorena Quesada, and Gladys Avalos. So I would also like to thank you for helping with the organization of all of this. And so I think there are a lot of questions I know that were raised, and it's a discussion that's going to go on. The conversation is going to continue. Thank you very much for coming tonight.